It's the week ending Saturday the 4th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen China introducing draconian security law into Hong Kong province, parts of the USA returning to lockdown as coronavirus numbers grow, and British pubs reopening for the first time in over 3 months. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Joe Evans, James Ashford, and boss man Holden Frith. Joe, you are up first this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week that new charges opened up old wounds in the Balkans?
And just to say, this clip you're about to hear has some graphic descriptions in it, so do feel free to skip 20 seconds.
When the Serbs, under the weight of the NATO pressure, decided to pull out, then it was possible to go around and see dead bodies rotting on the sides of the roads, people full of terrible tales of the kinds of things that had happened. And there was, as a result of all that, a real legacy of bitterness that continues.
The BBC's Jeremy Bowen, formerly their Kosovo correspondent, speaking in March 2019. Joe, what's happened this week?
So this week, Kosovo President Hashim Thaci has been indicted on 10 counts of war crimes dating back to the country's battle for independence from Serbia. Thaci commanded the Kosovo Liberation Army, and alongside a few other fighters, he has been held criminally responsible for nearly 100 murders. The Special Prosecutor's Office at The Hague has taken a fairly unusual step in that it's made these charges public before the indictment, which it says is because of Thaci's efforts to obstruct their work. However, the indictment has scuppered planned peace talks with the Serbian president, which has led some people to suggest that perhaps the reason The Hague has made this indictment public is because it's trying to avoid Thaci signing any type of deal with Serbia that would make him more difficult to touch politically.
I suppose also wanting to tell the world that, you know, they are interested in potentially prosecuting the ethnic Albanian side as well as the Serbian side all these years later.
Yeah, quite right. Lots of people have a sort of basic knowledge of the war and this type of things that the Serbians got up to in the war. It should be said, actually, that data from the Humanitarian Law Centre shows that 50% more Kosovo Albanians have been sentenced than Serbs, 37 to 25. And many inside Kosovo view the war as a struggle for liberation and now see that this indictment against their president could be a sort of stain on the independent state.
And James, there's clearly a strong case for seeking justice here, but what's the danger?
Well, I suppose anything that, as Joe says, reopens old wounds could lead to more tensions in the area. There's also something about reconciling that view that Serbia did commit the larger number of war crimes human rights bodies have observed, and yet there have been more Kosovo Albanians who have faced war crimes charges since the war. And also I think it's that point about there continuing to be dangers in the region. The war's never really gone away, and I think there's still obvious signs of tension between the two countries. We saw that even at the 2018 FIFA World Cup. When you had players who were ethnically Albanian but playing for Switzerland, and they played a match against Serbia, they then made a kind of symbol with their hands calling back to their Albanian heritage, made a lot of Serbians very upset.
I mean, Holden, generally people in the West, I mean, people in The Hague obviously have a very good understanding of international relations, but generally people in the West possibly don't understand those sensitivities and how they can still be just so resonant all these years later. It's a bit like Ireland in that sense, isn't it, to pick an example closer to our home?
It is. It's probably even more of the case with Kosovo because of the history of the West's intervention in the 1998-99 war. It really encouraged the view of a fairly straightforward conflict with the Kosovo Albanians as the underdogs, the victims, and the Serbian government as the aggressor. There was a certain element of truth to that, but as this case shows, it may be that it was a little bit more complicated. For most of us in the West, we've tended to see it as a closed conflict and a conflict in which the right people ultimately prevailed. But this does show that there's two sides to the argument and that argument is still ongoing, and we may well see it re-erupting in various different ways, both on the football field, as James was saying, but also in the streets of the Balkans, which is never a reassuring sentence to hear.
And Joe, I do wonder what this can teach us about former military leaders becoming political leaders. Because obviously that's quite a common thing in this kind of circumstance, isn't it, when someone fights for independence. But doesn't this situation kind of underline that it might have been better to have a president who had arisen out of that political movement but wasn't a military leader? Because inevitably when you have a former military leader, there's going to be stuff like this that's going to come up.
The issue, I think, here is that Taci is such a hero to Kosovo Albanians, and especially Kosovo Albanians that were involved in the fighting, because he was such a prominent figure in the KLA, and as a side effect has been an absolute stalwart of Kosovo politics ever since. He's held various government positions since 2009, became president in 2016. That conflict is so integral to the existence of Kosovo's identity that to try and suggest that a politician could rise out of any other movement is almost impossible.
Even if they were in the KLA, but just not literally the military leader. Because, you know, he's the man responsible for any of these alleged war crimes, isn't he?
It would be far easier to draw a line of responsibility in a less dirty war. I think it's quite difficult in a war like that which took place in Kosovo to draw direct lines of responsibility between military command and the actions of individuals on the ground. The KLA was a fairly sort of ragtag guerrilla army, which in part plays into the Kosovo Albanian sense of being the underdog, because they were facing up to the might of a far more well-equipped and well-funded Serbian army. That's not to say that Taci isn't responsible for any kind of wrongdoing during that war, and that's obviously for the Hague to decide. But as I say, I think that period of conflict with a far larger aggressor, and a far larger aggressor which persecuted Kosovo Albanians based on religious as well as national grounds, means that it's so integral to the Kosovan identity that someone like Taci was always really going to lead the country out of that period of conflict.
And it's obviously still important to him, Holden, to have the support of the West. I was looking at his Twitter profile just a moment ago, and interestingly, it's all in English. Like, I mean, it's for our benefit, isn't it? It's for the Americans' benefit.
Yeah, and it's interesting the extent to which competition about the narrative of Kosovan independence is still seen through the lens of various Western governments, and the fact that you have far more support for independence, which was only declared in 2008, 10 years after the start of the war. Immediately afterwards, Kosovo became a UN protectorate. It then made a unilateral declaration of independence in 2008. And that was recognised by most European countries, with a few exceptions, mostly those who were very reluctant to encourage secessionist movements in their own countries. So Spain is the major holdout of the West. Then world powers also tended to align with the side that they felt they had the closest association with. Russia has deep links with Serbia through culture and ethnicity. Even now, the diplomatic conflict between the West and Russia is playing out through Kosovo and through the Balkans, as it really has done for decades.
James, this was kind of the last war, really, that Britain got involved in that generally people feel we did some good. So what do you think our government can learn from this current situation?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting how people who are involved in that are seen differently now with kind of the benefit of history. So Tony Blair, for instance, was one of the kind of main people persuading NATO leaders to actually bomb Serbia in 1999, which brought an end to that conflict. So he's like a massive hero over there.
Has he answered your phone call since last week, or...?
Yeah, we chat regularly. Yeah. And also I thought I'd just mention that he's a hero in Albania now, just so he's absolutely clear that I do want to be his pal. I think lots of people call their kids Tony Blair in Kosovo, apparently. There's like a big phenomenon.
Is that really a thing?
Go meet them. Yeah, it's huge. They go and meet...
Wow.
Like, I think he actually went over in 2010 and they got him on a stage with loads of different kids called Tony Blair, and then one turned up a bit late and was just devastated that they hadn't met their hero, so it's quite nice. So I guess what I'm saying Western governments can learn from this is that intervention isn't always a bad thing. I think that obviously a lot of Western intervention recently has been very questionable, and Tony Blair obviously has been involved in a lot of that, but I think that it shows that when there is a genuine humanitarian NATO-backed case to get involved, then it's something that should be done. Especially, the UN Security Council described what Serbian forces were doing as ethnic cleansing, and I think when you've got a case of ethnic cleansing going on, is it not time for intervention? And actually, to me, it makes me think about what's going on in China with the Uyghur Muslims. We're doing very little. I'm not suggesting that we should go and start a military conflict with China, but surely we can pull on more diplomatic levers and put more international pressure on countries like China, who are doing essentially what other people are calling ethnic cleansing. Again, it's cultural genocide. So it's a similar thing, and we can learn those lessons.
But bearing in mind, Joe, that governments here are proud of that involvement, does this muddy the water a bit if he does actually end up getting prosecuted with these crimes?
Well, that's quite right, and it puts the West in a very difficult bind in that Taci has been the outward-looking face of Kosovo for so long. Western diplomats have been very happy to work with him. this has put them in a very difficult situation because they're now having to deal with someone that could potentially face war crime charges. Kosovo would likely turn around and say that throughout the early 90s, the West was very happy to deal with Serbian leadership, which would be a fair point, and actually the West was incredibly slow in both Bosnia and then Kosovo to sort of intervene. James is right to point out that Britain was a kind of leading advocate of intervention in Kosovo, though possibly because we were so slow off the ball in Bosnia. It's a very difficult situation as well because, as has been pointed out, the Balkans are a sort of strategic pinch point between the West and East. Serbia is backed by a very rich and Western hostile backer in Russia. Bosnia and Kosovo both looked to the European Union and looked to the European Union in the 90s for protection from Serbia, while Serbia was kind of committed, well, in Bosnia committing the second largest genocide in Europe since the Holocaust, and then in Kosovo again pursuing a program of ethnic cleansing. And I think it's very important to stress that the ideology behind that movement in Serbia really hasn't gone away. It's a nationalist ideology born out of a belief in the existence of a greater Serbia in which they're trying to unite all of the Serbs in the Balkans. And it's an area that encompasses Slovenia, parts of Yugoslavia, and has no space for the existence of Bosnia or Kosovo. It's a hugely, deeply ingrained cultural belief. You know, Radovan Karadzic, the former president of the Republika Srpska, used to write poetry about the existence of Greater Serbia. And not only has Europe moved on from the Kosovo War and thinks that this has dissipated, while they have moved on, this is so ingrained in Serbian society that to suggest that the Balkans are not still incredibly finely balanced is, I think, quite reckless.
Finally, Holden, just to give you the really easy question, what does the region need to do to avoid another conflict down the line? Or do you think actually it is just inevitable, really, given the circumstances that Joe's just outlined?
It does feel as if the process that began with the collapse of Yugoslavia hasn't yet run its course. And what you've seen is exactly what Joe was describing, of a series of ethnic groups trying to create homogenous blocks, really to the exclusion of all others. And the Kosovo War and independence was really a step towards that, with what was then a 90% Kosovo Albanian population getting their self-determination. That left a 10% Serbian population within Kosovo. It's now decreased to 5% because a lot of those people have fled across the border to Serbia. But you still have an unhappy minority within a majority, and then you still have the larger, much more powerful neighbour who are unhappy with the successionist power there. So it does feel as if we're not quite done with that process yet.
Indeed. Okay, Holden, you're up next after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are we heading for a second wave of rave?
Why do you feel like it is important to throw mass gatherings during this time?
Because you know it is, everyone's got their own vulnerabilities, and unfortunately the government or the powers that be can't get to everybody. Like, the media ain't concentrating on the amount of people that have killed themselves due to mental health problems, isolation, loneliness during this time and that, yeah. What these gatherings do, they allow people to be themselves and be free and not be judged, and to gather with similar like-minded people in a safe environment.
The anonymised thoughts of an illegal rave organiser speaking to Ter Dondi from Vice back in June. Holden, there's been a rise in illegal raves here in the UK and across Europe as well, arguably predictably, and actually quite widely reported. So why have you brought it to my podcast door?
Well, I think there's a few different things going on, and actually what I think has probably got most attention has been the street parties in cities, which have been taking place notably in London and Manchester. And they have got a lot of attention because it's quite hard to organise that kind of thing in a city without people noticing and without TV cameras following the action. But I think what has got slightly less attention is what you might call the more classic rave, the sort of big party in the field, arranged secretively and hastily, and people gathering in, sometimes in great numbers, 4,000 people in Daisy Nook Country Park near Oldham, but also often in a lot smaller groups. There have been sort of numerous events which have had 100, 200, 300 people, and a lot of these haven't really had any news attention because it's just much harder to keep track of those sorts of things. The other reason this is interesting is, in particular, that clip comes from a very surreal report from Vice, in which the organisers, as well as having their voices disguised, are also wearing, well, one's wearing a white hockey mask, the other sort of luminous green mask, while talking very earnestly about the coronavirus prevention measures they're taking and the need to wear PPE and to observe social distancing rules. So I just really wondered if this is sort of a new phenomenon of trying to take classic entertainment formats and modify them for the age of coronavirus.
I suppose the question is, does anything need to be modified? I'm assuming as the basis for this question that, we're condoning an illegal activity. I mean, obviously you're not supposed to be arranging an illegal rave at the moment. That goes without saying. But given that people are, it is outdoors. You can keep your distance from people there, can't you, if you want to? And, I mean, I know that you should be washing your hands and all that stuff, but that's the same when you're sitting in a pub garden. Is it any different, really, to the pub beer gardens opening?
Well, it may surprise you to learn that I've never actually been to a rave. So I presume they're all very orderly and people are entirely law-abiding. But there's a huge amount of pent-up desire for some sort of communal, joyful experience that doesn't take place over Zoom. And some people are going to be rushing to their pubs this weekend. Some people are going to be jumping on the first flights to Spain. Some people are going to go to a field and dance around. And while we don't know the exact risk calculation for each of those activities, it does feel as if being outside in a field may well not be the most risky way of having some kind of social contact.
Well, that is one of the things about rave culture, isn't it? It's always had its uppers and downers. James, when it comes to organising a rave, do you support the idea that actually there isn't a great deal of difference between some of the other lockdown measures that are being relaxed, or is it just simply irresponsible because there's no need? There is literally no need. You're not supporting business like you are when you go to an established business that pays its taxes, and you are risking spreading the virus.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could be supporting kind of local drug dealers who've had a really tough time with it, I think. They've really not been able to sell as many party drugs. So
Tony
I guess
Blair's now definitely not returning that call.
Which I think is a scandal. Let me finish, Ollie. And that is awful. It's more about what we accept culturally, isn't it? So we all like the idea of the British going to the pub vibe, and that's why we're all excited about doing it, and that's why the Treasury are putting out tweets saying you can all go to the pub, which is really weird. But I don't think the Treasury are going to start putting out tweets saying you can all go to a rave in a field, because culturally it's just not what we think is the normal thing. Like, it seems it's a bit more out there, and the illegality of it is irrelevant as far as I'm concerned, because people have been breaking the law in various different ways throughout lockdown, and I don't think that this is a special case.
The parallels, though, are interesting, aren't they, Joe, between the 90s when rave culture was at its apex and now. I'm thinking just simply of basically young people have no money and are worried about their futures, and then rave comes along.
The oldest that I was in the 90s was 4 years old, so I'm not particularly familiar with 90s rave culture. But I think there is something to be said for the fact that a lot of young people are feeling socially starved. They've been locked up in their houses for months, and many of them have been made redundant at the same time. There's a lot to be said for the fact that these people just need something to do and want to feel some sense of communal warmth and feel something good in this last kind of 3 months, which can be very difficult for lots of people. I think the slight difference between this and the pub garden comparison is that, having tried to get a booking for a pub on Saturday to celebrate their reopening with some friends, the pubs are being very careful about numbers of people showing up, and obviously are taking kind of steps with staff and things to keep people safe. I think the slight danger with the illegal rave stuff is that they're kind of organised through Snapchat and Instagram. A lot of the time people start live streaming the events and hundreds more people show up. At the same time, I do also think, kind of to go back to your point about the 90s rave culture, whether or not heavily regulating social distancing and how close you can come to your fellow ravers will strip some of the fun away from an illegal rave, I'm not sure. The other, I think, kind of point to be made is that in a pub beer garden, quite a lot less ecstasy is taken, which is not a drug that is famously good for people socially distancing from one another.
Well, that's it, isn't it, Holden? I mean, we can have lots of earnest debates about whether there's any difference between different types of drugs, including alcohol and their various risks. But I suppose the point is, as long as drugs like that are illegal, then you're committing a criminal act by selling them. And at some of those raves, you have criminal elements turning up. There was one in Manchester where there was a stabbing, there was a rape accusation. So, that doesn't happen in most beer gardens.
No, there's definitely a dark side to this movement, as well as a side that I think probably can have a sort of huge positive sense of community to people. But I think there's clearly big risks apart from coronavirus. There are risks of spreading coronavirus too, and actually to the point of whether dancing around may carry more risk of transmission. It actually might, because if you're sitting quietly, breathing through your nose, talking quietly, you're expelling a lot less virus through the droplets in your breath than if you're jumping around exerting yourself. So you would probably need a greater social distance between people in a field where people are dancing. But it's not just pub gardens that are going to be open from this weekend. It's indoor pubs too. And there's talk about how governments might be able to get nightclubs open as well. We don't know how long it will take before we get to a cure or a vaccine. The feeling is that that's going to be many, many months more. We're not looking at weeks, and the local lockdown we've seen in Leicester, and that this is something we're going to be living with for months and months, and we should probably plan not just to stop doing all of the things that might give us some sense of enjoyment, but look at ways we can modify the sorts of things we would like to do and find ways to make them as compatible with the virus as possible. And I'm not saying that everyone should go and rave every weekend, but we've all adapted to a lot of measures which felt fairly ridiculous when we first did them. If people want to go to a rave, maybe they will have to just adapt to certain things like quarantining themselves afterwards for a couple of weeks, or even getting a test afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the music festivals, the vast majority of them obviously are cancelled for this summer. And James, a lot of people are missing that. It's legitimate to ask about, in the leisure industry, how you can, in a virus-safe way, hold an event like that, because as Holden says, it's an issue that's going to come up next summer, probably. Are there lessons that can be learned from this?
I guess we can look at what happens to the people who go to the raves. That might teach us some lessons. If there are suddenly loads of outbreaks stemming from these raves, then that might be a sign that they should stop. I mean, right now it's a bit of a guinea pig thing, isn't it? We don't really know what happens. We do know that we had Cheltenham Festival when the virus was on its way up, and that caused loads of infections. I think it's basically this point about what do people kind of vaguely sneer at and what do people think is acceptable. And then, as Holden said, go to a villa, go to a pool. That's apparently fine. The pub is fine. Going to a rave, which is a bit more outside the mainstream, is not fine. So I think honestly, it really is about what we kind of tolerate and think is normal and acceptable in culture. There's no scientific reason to think that raving is more dangerous than it will be when the gyms open later in July or in August, or whenever they're going to open. There's still lots of breathing out going on then, but you're in a confined space. So maybe the thing, which actually sounds super square, but maybe the thing that we can do is try and regulate the raves a little bit, which I know kind of defeats the object of raving, but maybe allow for outside gatherings where there's music and stuff, so you kind of got a festival or rave-esque vibe going on without it actually being some crazy illicit rave. And why is everybody on the Zoom call now looking at me like I am the nerdiest person in the world?
I'm just thinking that Tony Blair would thoroughly approve of that answer. You
Definitely.
found the third way for rave.
I can see the t-shirt now. Frankie says, regulate the raves a little bit. James, you're up next after this. Okay, James, you're finishing this show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why ISIS have had a bitter pill to swallow.
We do believe that we can call it the drug of the ISIL and Daesh, because we found the captagon, that is the symbol on any amount of drug seized, and the whole amount comes from Syria.
That was Jules Suzdaltsev in an explainer for Now This. You can check out the full video on their YouTube channel, Now This World. James, what's the story?
Well, the story is that police in Italy say they've confiscated a huge shipment of amphetamines, 14 tons of the stuff, which they say was produced by ISIS in Syria. They're calling it the largest ever amphetamine haul in the world, both in terms of value and quantity.
Okay, there's already a lot to unpack, but just on the business of ISIS making amphetamines, is that a thing?
Yeah, the captagon, which is the drug, it's phenethylene, I think is the medical name. It's called the drug of jihad. It's a drug that is very much associated with ISIS. A lot of ISIS members take this drug because it's kind of a stimulant and it gets them going to do all their evil stuff in a very energetic way. But also they're making quite a lot of money from producing it and selling it. There are questions since the police in Italy have come out and said that ISIS are behind this shipment, suggesting that actually this could be the work of Hezbollah in Syria rather than ISIS. But we know that ISIS do make drugs, they do make amphetamines, maybe not on this scale.
Maybe it's not a surprise since we know that drugs are obviously circulated via criminal gangs, that ISIS would have a hand in that as well. But I suspect a lot of listeners like me are just a bit taken aback by that idea. Because presumably these drugs were for sale in Italy and the rest of Europe, and so people using these drugs, and we were just talking about drug use at raves, would be inadvertently supporting terrorist organisations.
For years, there's been a link drawn between terrorism and the illicit drug trade, because it's not just ISIS who do this. Hezbollah, as we've just said, they also do it. Loads of other terrorist groups or groups with links to terrorism have been involved in the drug trade before. This shipment, it was worth €1 billion. It was coming into Italy, and Italian police say that it was due to go around Europe, which suggests that that was going to be European people in European countries buying these drugs. It was also facilitated by the mafia in southern Italy. So the organised crime groups there knew about it, they were helping out, and the police have basically said you don't get €1 billion worth of drugs coming into southern Italy without the mafia being involved to some degree. So it is this whole thing with terrorism, organised crime, it's pretty much all the bad stuff in the world lumped into one big shipment of drugs.
And links between some of those organisations as well that might surprise people. Why, though, Holden, has the Middle East become such a drug factory? You don't think of Syria when you think of drugs manufacture.
I think it is just the lawlessness of the area, the fact that there is no government control, there's no police force. If you wanted to set up a synthetic drugs lab, you're unlikely to attract the attention of the authorities. And also there is demand, both because the various militant groups need money. They need money to fund payments for fighters, but also for arms deals, and also, as James said, that they use the drugs themselves to fuel their armies and to reduce the inhibitions of the people who they're sending out to do terrible things.
You made quite a flippant reference to that, James, but is that really the case? You're saying that ISIS fighters and fighters presumably from other armed groups use drugs to help them stay focused?
Yeah, big time. This is something that we've known about for ages, and I think that it's not only are fighters in Syria taking these drugs. There have been people who've committed terrorist acts in the West they've found kind of traces of drugs in their possessions and things too. So I think terrorists are essentially using these stimulants, as Holden said, to get over their inhibitions, also to keep them alert. But drugs like this have been used by militaries on both sides or on all sides for years. They were used, I think, back in the Second World War by RAF pilots and US pilots. They were used by the Nazis. I think they used meth.
The use of methamphetamine in Nazi Germany is really interesting, because it was, as well as being used by the military, particularly during the Blitz, to give them alertness and strength to keep fighting 24 hours on end. It was also actually thoroughly co-opted into Nazi German ideology, and whereas they were, much like Islamic fundamentalists, very anti-drugs in theory, they did make an exception for stimulants such as amphetamines, because they saw that, whereas alcohol or heroin may be part of a sort of social degeneracy or a lessening of human strength, the amphetamines were seen as a tool for enhancing strength and vigilance and physical perfection, and they were going to power the master race to be even more masterful. So there was a very similar selective blind spot in terms of the use of social recreational drugs and their incorporation into the military effort.
I was going to say, I wonder if ISIS have a similar justification, because it doesn't seem like the most halal thing to be doing, to be producing illegal drugs and selling them to the mafia.
Some researchers have suggested that actually quite a lot of global terrorist organisations are actually sort of hybrid global drug trafficking cartels as well, because they're able to use ideological motivations to mask financial ones. The two things that kind of correlate between drug cartels and terrorist organisations is that they need huge swathes of land in order to sort of operate a cartel, but also operate a caliphate, and they need a sort of public that can be easily melded through fear, and that actually the things that you need to build the groundworking of a cartel perfectly correlate with that which were required for IS to build a caliphate in the Middle East.
There's been quite a lot written about the connections between Islamist terror groups, originally Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, and various mafia groups in Italy, and even the suggestion that this might go some way to explain why Italy hasn't had a major Islamist attack despite its involvement in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and despite even the sort of symbolic value of Rome as a centre of Christendom, that it has escaped relatively unscathed.
Oh, I love a good conspiracy theory to finish off the show.
Well, there's various theories as to why this might be, and they are fairly contradictory. But one is that the there is, and which this story feeds into, which there is honour amongst thieves between them, and so that there haven't been attacks because the mafia is seen as allies or agents in some way. But another is that actually the mafia itself offers some sort of protection, and because of their dominance of territory. The slightly more prosaic explanation, and possibly the more likely, is that it's actually more of a product of the Italian state's experience of fighting the organised crime networks, the fact that they have very strong surveillance laws in place and witness protection schemes, and they're just very good at infiltrating secretive groups. So they've been able to penetrate the networks in the way that other Western security forces haven't.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because the drugs on this occasion weren't caught by kind of scanners at the port. It was intelligence intercepting phone calls of Italian mafia members, which ended up getting the police info on the bust. So I think Holden's right that it is these kind of practices of Italian police. They've got that experience.
Well, there are a lot of fascinating threads left hanging there, and thank you for bringing up lots of clickbait terms that will hopefully help many more people discover the show. We've had Nazis, grooming and meth all in that one story. But that is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to James, Holden and Joe. Remember, you can listen to our entire back catalogue. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producers were Sarah Miles and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.